Before starting the story, let us know where you're watching from and what time you're watching. Screaming in the storm. The storm had been brewing for hours, a monstrous thing that rolled in from the sea like a vengeful god. The sky turned an unnatural shade of green, and the wind howled like a wounded beast. The small coastal town of Black Hollow was no stranger to storms, but this one felt different. It felt alive. Maggie stood at the window of her grandmother's old house, clutching a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The house creaked and groaned under the weight of the wind, its ancient timbers protesting against the onslaught. She had come here to escape the chaos of her life in the city, to find solace in the quiet of the seaside. But the storm had other plans. The first scream came just as the power went out. It was faint at first, almost lost in the cacophony of the storm. Maggie froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was unmistakable, a human scream, raw and desperate, carried on the winds. She told herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her, the way it sometimes mimicked voices or laughter. But deep down, she knew better. The scream came again, louder this time, and closer. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled toward the front door. She shouldn't go out. It was madness to even consider it. But what if someone was out there, hurt or in danger? She couldn't just ignore it. She grabbed her grandmother's old raincoat from the hook by the door and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall, nearly knocking her off her feet. Rain lashed at her face, stinging her skin. The scream came again, closer still, and Maggie's blood ran cold. She followed the sound, her feet slipping on the wet ground. The storm seemed to grow louder with every step, the wind howling in her ears. The scream came again, and this time she could tell it was coming from the direction of the cliffs. The cliffs! Maggie's stomach churned at the thought. The cliffs were dangerous even on a calm day, their jagged edges crumbling into the sea below. In a storm like this, they were a death trap. But the scream came again, and Maggie knew she had no choice. She fought her way through the storm, the wind and rain pushing her back with every step. The scream grew louder, more desperate, until it was all she could hear. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Maggie froze, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence was worse than the screaming. It was heavy, oppressive, like the calm before the storm. She took a step forward, then another, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the cliff, silhouetted against the storm. It was a woman, her long hair whipping around her face in the wind. She was dressed in white, the fabric clinging to her body like a second skin. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as the woman turned to face her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. And then, without warning, she stepped off the edge of the cliff. Maggie screamed, lunging forward, but it was too late. The woman was gone, swallowed by the storm and the sea below. Maggie fell to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the storm. But deep down, she knew better. She stumbled back to the house, her mind racing. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a wounded beast. Maggie locked the door behind her and sank to the floor, her body trembling. She told herself she was safe, that the storm would pass and everything would be okay. But the scream came again, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Maggie's blood ran cold. She told herself it was just the storm, that it couldn't be real. But the scream came again, louder this time, and closer. She covered her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The scream was inside her head, echoing in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Maggie sat in the silence, her heart pounding in her chest. The storm raged on outside, but the house was eerily quiet. She told herself it was over, that the scream was gone. But then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of fabric. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the sound. The woman in white stood in the corner of the room, her pale face illuminated by a flash of lightning. Her eyes were empty, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Maggie tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. Maggie scrambled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. And then the woman was on her cold hands wrapping around Maggie's throat. Maggie struggled, but it was no use. The woman's grip was like iron, her eyes boring into Maggie's soul. The last thing Maggie saw before the darkness took her was the woman's face, twisted into a grotesque smile. The storm raged on, the winds howling like a wounded beast. And somewhere, in the distance, a scream echoed through the night. What? The storm passed, leaving behind a town that was eerily quiet. The people of Black Hollow went about their lives as if nothing had happened, but they all felt it, the lingering sense of dread that hung in the air like a fog. Maggie's grandmother's house stood empty, its windows dark and lifeless. No one dared to go near it, not after what had happened. But sometimes, on stormy nights, the scream could still be heard, faint and distant, carried on the wind. And those who heard it knew better than to investigate. For the woman in white was still out there, waiting for her next victim. And the storm would always bring her back.